a living history production.
I'm Matt McLachlan.
And I'm Pete Smith.
We're battlefield historians who love nothing better than getting out and walking the ground where great battles in history took place.
And now we'd like you to come with us. Every week, BattleWalks will take you to one of the great battlefields of Europe.
As we walk the ground, we'll dig through the pages of history. We'll uncover the secrets of the battlefields, and most importantly, we'll tell the stories of the people who fought and died there.
Welcome to BattleWalks. Hello everyone, welcome to BattleWalks. I'm Pete Smith. Sadly today my co-presenter Matt McLachlan is unable to be with us, neither by the magic of the airwaves or with me in person, during what will be the second of our on the ground podcasts. Actually, Matt and I have visited this site together previously, so he's not missing too much. So, today, where are we? We're going to be visiting the village of Naours in the department of the Somme. Naours nestles in a wooded valley, about 18 kilometres to the west of Amiens, which places it about 30k behind the front lines of 1916 during the famous Battle of the Somme. So you have to ask yourself what was going on 30 kilometres behind the lines which would interest us. Well, these villages were hives of activity. Many of them would never see the like again, and it's interesting, I often go through these villages, they're quiet, there's nobody here, or very few people here, populations far less than they would have been during the Great War, but certainly during that period they were absolutely thriving, and of course a lot of the villagers made quite a bit of money from the soldiers in the area. So how would the soldiers arrive in this area? Well, they'd arrive by lorry, by train, on foot, and normally a combination of all three. Units rotating in and out of the line, passing through or staying in the area for days or sometimes weeks. The men were accommodated, often in bell tents, in Nissen huts, a kind of prefabricated hut, Adrian huts, the same but the French version, Armstrong huts, which are, again, a different type of prefabricated hut, the local farms, and of course the people's houses when they could get in them. I suspect that the soldiers would have preferred being in somebody's house, a little bit of that home comfort. What were they doing here? Well, they were training for battle. So you would have found practice trenches, ranges for both shooting, grenade throwing, mock battles took place here, of course the old proverbial parades, and they were re-equipped here, ready for their next stint in the front line. But they also rested in these areas after combat, or sometimes before. The soldiers were given that opportunity to recover and prepare. So what were they doing? Well, letter writing. We know that from all of the postcards and letters that were sent home, many of which still survive. Sports, they went and watched the silent films. There were theatres, baths, so they could clean themselves up. And of course religion, a big part of some of the soldiers' lives. All taking place in these villages around where we are now. The men also visited the bars and the estaminets, and that's an interesting term, estaminets. It's a term that doesn't exist anymore. It's a bar that sells food. And of course, that place that we don't tend to talk about too much, the old brothels. Also, you'd have found those in these areas. I hasten to add that this podcast is not going to be coming from a wartime brothel. Other things that the soldiers got up to were organised outings. They wanted to get out and about during their periods of when they weren't training, their downtime. So there were organised outings to photographers, to historic sites, to markets, to shops. But perhaps the most important, it was a time to meet the local population, to relax, and for a few days to forget what had been and, of course, what was to come. So without further ado, let's get on the ground in the village of Naours.
Welcome to BattleWalks and the second of our outside on the ground podcasts. I'm here with Sarah, who is my partner, and also the only Australian guide working on the site. And she's going to be my official door opener, prompter, and will ensure that I don't get lost, because it's quite easy to get lost in here. We're standing beside a fairly ordinary wooden door at a location in Naours, which is a village known as the Cité Souterraine de Naours, or Site Souterrain de Naours. Underground City of Naours. You have to excuse my French pronunciation again. Behind this door, at an average depth of 33 metres, we have 30 tunnels, stretching for over 2 kilometres, with an estimated 300 rooms. Now, we haven't got time to go into all of those rooms, and in fact, they haven't all been excavated, but there's enough for us to explore. So how does this site relate to the experience of the soldier of World War One? To answer that, really, I need to explain a little bit about the history of the site before we actually pass through the door. Caves have always been a place of refuge, and we know that during the war, the men will use caves for safety and protection. In this case, we're too far behind the line, so that's not the case. These caverns were all hand dug into the chalk, so they're not natural. Every single one was actually hand dug, and they can be dated as far back as the Roman times. And certainly we know that during the Viking raids of the 6th century they were used. They were used again during the Norman invasion of this area. They were used in the 100 Years' War. I'm sure you're getting the idea. These have been developed and expanded upon throughout history, but perhaps the most important time was during a period from 1618 to 1648, which is known as the 30 Years' War, a terrible time for Europe, I have to say. One of the most traumatic periods of Europe's history, all to do with religion, and it's estimated that over 8 million people could have lost their lives during these religious wars that went backwards and forwards across all of Europe. These caverns were used at that time. They were created and used. Very much the people hid in here at times of danger. And eventually they, as history fades and their use fades, they disappeared almost into obscurity and were almost forgotten about. At the end of the 19th century, there's a priest in this area who comes to be the local priest. He's also an archaeologist called Father Danny Corr. And he searched for these. He knew about them and he found them, and then he requested from the pulpit help from the local people to come and excavate them. And he thought that two things: it's going to give the local people work. There wasn't an awful lot of work, and it's paid labour to excavate these caverns. And also he could see that there could be possibly religious connotations connected with these, and he made them much more religious than they had been. But also he knew that people would be interested, that the history of the caverns and the caves here, the hiding places, would become historic. And he was right, and by the 1890s they become well known, and they were a tourist attraction. And that's the key: these are a tourist attraction, and they will attract the soldiers who are going to be serving in this area. So we're standing in front of the door. Sarah's going to open the door for us. I'm just going to stand up and head towards the door. Big oak door. So we're just opening the door now, and it's a bit gloomy in here. We're heading down some stairs. So these are actually brick-built stairs. Interestingly, this brick aspect of it, as you enter, and some of the rooms and the handrail and the electricity that is down here, even though it has been rewired, are from the Second World War, because the Germans became aware of this site, and they didn't come here as tourists. They came here looking at a place to store ammunition and equipment, and they took over the caves and use them for storing munitions here. So we're just walking down flights of stairs until we get to the ground, the base. So we're now at 30 metres below ground, and we are heading up a narrow corridor. And this corridor two people could pass side by side, but not much more than that. And we're heading towards a room, and this room is an important room for what we're going to be discussing. It's been newly, protected. It's got a new door on it, a pine door, and we're just standing in front of the door. So what I'm going to do is we'll stop here and we'll have a little chat about what went on here. So one of the things to ask is, if soldiers are going to visit this site, how are they literally getting here? Well, we know there were organised trips, that some of the units who are resting in the area, some of the battalions, some of the drivers, the transportmen, they got time off and they came here. And so they cycled here if they could get hold of push bikes. They walked here if they were very close by, or they came on military transport to the site. This is known as the Chambre de Tourisme. so the Chamber of Tourism, and it's a private room. The average, tourist coming to this area, he's not allowed in this room. It has to be on a battlefield tour, and it'll become very obvious when we go into the room why that is. So the lighting's very low, and I quite like that. You can bring a torch, you can get torches as you enter, and it's quite nice to have a torch and start shining them on the walls themselves. Because this is why we're here. It's because on these walls, the soldiers signed their names. So as they visited, they signed their names. We have Australians, British, Canadians, South Africans, New Zealanders, Americans, and of course the Germans from the Second World War, and overriding all of that, the French from before the war and after the war. They came here and left their signatures on the walls. So let's just have a little chat about why people are leaving their signatures on the walls here. And I think this is perhaps one of the most interesting aspects. And we don't really know exactly. It's down to that individual. Are you leaving it here just because you like graffiti and you like scribbling on things? Well, I'm sure there's an element of everybody likes to leave their name about. Are they here because there is a distinct religious overtone to this site, and that's because the priest that discovered it, he made it quite religious. And so is it the religious aspect? If you're a soldier and you're going into combat, would you like to leave your name? And hopefully that'll bring you maybe perhaps a little more luck if you left your name in a religious site. Or is it men, and I think this is probably the most likely, men who know, very sadly, that they may be leaving the world soon. They're going into combat and they may be killed, and they just want to leave something of themselves on a world that they may be leaving. And sadly, that is the case in many of these names that are on the walls here. So we're just opening the door, and we're now entering the room. Sarah's doing all of the opening and shutting of doors and unlocking things for me. And I don't know really how to explain it, because it's chalk, it's white, it's hewn chalk, so it's little flat areas all over that have been deliberately smoothed off to make them even smoother. There are flint nodules here in the roof and on the walls, so flint naturally occurs in chalk. And on all of it, and we get bats here as well, Sarah's just pointing out to me, there's a little pipistrelle bat hanging from the roof in here. And every flat space has a signature on it. It's just truly extraordinary that men came in, and they were obviously carrying pencils. They were given pencils, because these are not your standard military indelible pencil that's blue. This is all black pencil, and to me, it looks like the soldiers were given pencils, and when you go down there, mate, sign your name on the wall. And so we have names all over the wall. Sometimes it's just a signature. Sometimes it's just where they came from. But for a lot of the men, they left absolutely everything here. So I'm just going to read a couple of the names that are on here, and then we've done a bit of research on the signatures, so I can tell you a little bit of a story. And that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be walking around these chambers, these tunnels, these caves, and telling stories of some of the men that actually signed their signatures down here. So the first one I'm going to read is, I can see it on the wall now, 9th in big thick pencil, 9th Battalion Australians, C. Fitzhenry, Paddington, Sydney, NSW, New South Wales, and then 1916 July, and then underneath it, Alistair Ross Lismore. So these are two men from the 9th Battalion. They're both Australians, and they've signed their names and written this together. So they're obviously friends. A very sad story, this one, because both of them will lose their lives during the Great War. So who, in fact, are these guys? Well, a little bit confusing, because Charles Fitzhenry, and it just shows you the research you have to do, is his real name. But he wasn't serving under Charles Fitzhenry. He was serving under Private 1126 William Doyle. And he was a shearer, born in Casino, New South Wales, and enlisted in Queensland, so he'd obviously moved. He served at Gallipoli, as they both did. He would be wounded 3 times, and sadly the last one being fatal, when he was shot in the head on the 10th of August 1918. He didn't die. It was a wounding, but he will die a little later on the 21st of August 1918 at Le Treport, which is up on the coast. It's one of those the medical centres on the coast. I think at Le Treport it's the 3rd Canadian General Hospital is based there, so he was probably there, and he's buried there in Mount Huon Military Cemetery. I think that's how you pronounce it, Sarah. Huon, do we think? Yeah, Huon. Well, she's nodding. His friend, the Alistair Ross, from Lismore. Again, we have a slight ambiguity. He is spelling his name Tair, but he enlisted as T-E-R, Alistair. So he anglicised his name from the Scottish, because he's a Scot. He was born in Scotland. Oh, and Sarah's just pointing out that actually he signed his name twice within this room, and he used both spellings. On one he spells it one way, on the other he spells it the other way. So Scottish, and then you would have to say an anglicised version of his name. And he was, born in Scotland. In fact, we know that he had a tattoo on his arm of a Scottish thistle. And he had also served in the British Army as a territorial before he came out here in the 4th Seaforth Highlanders, before he actually emigrated to Australia. At Gallipoli, he was saved from a piece of shrapnel that hit his Bible, which is in his breast pocket, and that saved his life. So, again, also serving at Gallipoli. And he was still carrying that Bible in France. It had been given to him by his mother, and he wrote in it. And it just shows you how terrible the battle of fighting at Poitiers must have been. Came safely through the Battle of Poitiers. Battle lasted nearly a week. My battalion had many casualties. I had many narrow escapes. Came through safely. And he wrote that in his diary on the 6th of August in 1916. Sorry, his Bible on the 6th of August 1916. And sadly, on the 22nd of August 1916, he lost his life fighting at Muquet Farm, which is also part of the Poitiers battlefield. His body was not recovered, and he's commemorated on the VB Memorial to the missing. Interesting, if you want to track down that Bible, it is actually at the Anzac Memorial, Hyde Park in Sydney. So we can actually see that Bible. It must have been recovered from his body before his body became lost on the battlefield. What's obvious from looking at all of these names is that a lot of research needs to be done when you're trying to find these names. It's ongoing. It is ongoing, the research that's been done with the names here, and it's part of the enjoyment, actually. My enjoyment certainly is looking at the names and trying to discover more about the men, especially the English soldiers. A little bit more difficult for the soldiers from Britain to actually to find out who they are, because their service files don't exist. So let's look at a British soldier's name. Corporal Wallston has written his name here. What he'd written on the wall was Corporal Wallston 6th MAC. RAMC, and that's the 6th Motor Ambulance Convoy, of which he's a member, Royal Army Medical Corps. So this guy is a stretcher bearer, effectively, or is a medic in a vehicle going backwards and forwards, picking up people, wounded soldiers from the front line. That's what the Motor Ambulance Convoy generally do. They wait from the dressing stations, or as close as they can get, bringing the people back. So who is he? Well, he's number 47688, Corporal Irving Wallston. He was born in Manchester, and enlisted and was living in London when the war started. He was lightly gassed on the 13th of July 1917. I don't know why I say lightly. Any kind of gassing's not particularly good. And he had a hernia in the August of 1917, and perhaps that's more understandable from lugging heavy stretchers about. He'd been awarded the Military Medal. It just states in his file for an act of courage, because he does have a little bit of a file, in 1915, and he was married during the war and also had a child during the war who was born in 1918, and he will survive the war. So that's a nice inscription to find. Two more before we move off here, and these are inscriptions that are odd because they don't have names or anything. They're just people writing things, and one says Durban, South Africa, 19th of the 3rd, 1916. And the other one, perhaps more interesting, is almost a political slogan. It says Primrose Day, 19th of April, 1916. And in fact, Primrose Day was the anniversary of the death of a British Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, who died on the 19th of April in 1881. Primrose was his favourite flower, and something called the Primrose League was formed, and it was a conservative organisation described as with cross-class appeal. So you can see why it lasted a long time. And in fact, the Primrose League was only wound up in 2004 after 121 years. So just a political slogan written on the walls. And in fact, I think it's the only political slogan written on the walls. So we're now going back into the gallery. Sarah's going to turn the light off behind me. walking down the gallery that we came up, many rooms off each side. These rooms have all had a little bit of work done to them. They tend to have frames which shows that they had doors on and a bit of brickwork, and that's because these are part of the rooms used by the Germans. We're not going to go and have a look at the German signatures today, but in one of those rooms we have some German signatures of German soldiers who were working here. We're now going to go left, down another narrow passageway again. These passageways about the two people can pass. Flint sticking out all over, little nodules of flint and chalk. And what we're heading for is a little chapel. So here we are. We're standing in a very small chapel. It's got the Virgin Mary at the end. And this room is described as the chapel. And it's room number 6. So we have a name here, and I think this name is. I think the names in here are all interesting because these are probably guys who were perhaps quite religious and felt that this may help if they came into this room and left their signatures in here. Again, we'll never know for certain. So we have a name written on the wall here: C.C.J. McCann, 27th Battalion, South Australia. We don't know what the actual date was that he arrived here, but we know the month. It was March in 1917. Now he, Lieutenant Claude Cyril John McCann, had seen some serious combat. He was only 23 years old, and when he came in here he was a company sergeant major, so he'd not yet been commissioned. He will be commissioned, and he will also be awarded the Military Cross for the fighting on the Menin Road in the September of 1917. He'd also been wounded twice, once at Poitiers on the 4th of August 1916, and then again at the Advance to Victory on the 9th of August 1918. He will survive the war, thankfully, so perhaps signing here may have done him some good, but certainly he saw some very heavy combat. He also had two brothers who served. Sadly, one of those will not survive the war. He was Lance Corporal Jack McCann of the 43rd Battalion, and he was killed at La Hamel on the 4th of July and is buried at Crucifix Corner in Villers-Bretonneux. His other brother was a Major William McCann, 10th Battalion, and he'd been awarded the DSO, Distinguished Service Order, a Military Cross twice, so MC and Bar, and he also survived to return to Australia. So we're going to leave the little chapel, and we're going to, a little bit of walking to do now. We're going to head along this rather ripply floor. The floor ripples, it's chalk as well, it's discoloured by lots and lots of people walking on it. Walking across the corridor we came in on, and into an area that is very rough-hewn. So this is rough cut. Again, the ceiling's just out of reach. I can almost reach it. We're going up some stairs, starting to feel a little bit like I'm on the set of Indiana Jones here. Up the top of the stairs, the ceiling again is dropped, so the ceiling's quite close to us again. Lights along the way, so we're not in complete darkness. Just so you can get an idea of how we are. We're dressed in fairly warm clothes because it can get a little bit chilly in here. My notes, I've got a little light on my notes. Sarah's got a torch so we can see what we're doing. Climbing up some more stairs, handrails at each side, and into a room that really does feel like you're on the set of Indiana Jones. We have a large pillar to our right-hand side, religious symbolism again, Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus, and which is way above us. And interestingly, when we came here earlier, just doing a quick run-through of it, I said to Sarah, how big is this? And she pointed out to my right-hand side, and on this pillar, it actually gives the height of the pillar 22 metres. So we're looking up 22 metres up to the roof. And the roof here is timbered. This is the area when they cleared these caverns and caves and walkways. This is where they removed all the rubble in the in the 1890s. This is how they removed all of the rubble out of here. 1880s, I suppose, is when they would have started. So, where are we? Well, this one is called the Rotund, and oh, thank you. Sarah's giving me instructions. She's saying because there are 4 entries here, the four entries coming in from different directions. So it's kind of a roundabout, I suppose, really almost. It's the central point in this area. Blocks of chalk. This is what makes this unusual and feel like a tomb almost, is because this is actually walled. It's got solid blocks of chalk that have been built into supports and into entrances. But these square blocks are great for writing on. So again, it's absolutely covered as far as you can reach, and you have to say occasionally the guys must have literally climbed on each other's shoulders to get a little higher so they could scribble a name a little bit higher. So names all over the walls, and perhaps one of the most interesting names here, again, it's two mates. It's two mates who are writing their names quite often side by side. They are both serving in the same battalion, the 16th Battalion. So I'm going to read what's written, walking across now. Sarah's just taking a photograph of it. So C. Hyde, Perth, and he's got W 1916 Os. So it's Western Australia 1916. And the other one, W. Police, Perth, WA, Western Australia. So they obviously came from the same area. They're serving in the same battalion, which I think was raised in, was it raised in Western Australia? So I think so, 16th Battalion. So Private Cecil Hyde, the first man that we mentioned, 16th Battalion, born in Eastbourne in the UK. Again, he's another Brit who obviously emigrated to Australia. And his friend is Sergeant William Police, 16th Battalion. He was born in Adelaide. Now, Police is not his original name, even though he joined up with Police. His original name was Polizo, and his father had emigrated from the Greek island of Skopelos, so one of the early Greek immigrants to Australia. Both of them will serve together, and they will both fight at Bulkor on the 11th of May 1917, and sadly one of them will not survive. So Private Cecil Hyde of the 16th Battalion, he was actually killed in action on the 11th of April 1917, first day of the first battle of Bulkor, and he has no known grave, and he's commemorated on the VB memorial to the missing at Villers-Bretonneux. So his good friend Sergeant William Police, who was reported missing on the 11th of April in 1917 at Bulkor. He was wounded, but he became a prisoner of war. So he was captured and will eventually be repatriated back to the UK in 26th of the 12th, 1918. So one survives, one doesn't. I like these two guys. Sarah and I have done quite a bit of work on them, just reading their service files very closely, trying to find more about them. And they sign their names everywhere. That's the one thing to say. We are in the first room that we found their names, but they signed them multiple times in this room. It's quite extraordinary how many times they signed their names throughout. And we suspect, we'll never know for certain, but we suspect that they may have been involved with the site. While their battalion, the 16th Battalion, was here, we think they may have come up here, done a bit of a recce, found out what was going on, found out that this is an interesting site. And we think they may have been charging their men a bit of dosh to bring them up here. And because they are both, you have to say, the service files, you can tell they're a bit of Jack the Lads. And we think that they possibly brought people here and showed them round. So that's why they signed their names all over the place. But we'll never know for certain. So we're going to move on again. We will cross their paths again. I'm sure Sarah's going to point out to me where William Police and Cecil Hyde have signed. No, she's doing it now, just as we're leaving. Now, again, slight feel of Indiana Jones. We're going through a very narrow passageway, which is a block-built chalk block passageway, which you have to turn sideways. I'm turning sideways, walking sideways to get through it. It's so tight. We're now opening up into a larger room. So into a larger room, we can see very clearly the flint banding. We're going downhill again, so we're going deeper underground here. Remembering that this is all underground, you can probably tell. I'm hoping you get a feel from the echoing of my voice as we're walking down some steps. We're going past a trough on the left-hand side. It's an animal trough because in those periods where the local people hid in here, they were expecting to be here for some time. So they'd brought livestock down here and food for livestock, and also troughs where they could have where they could water them. And in fact, there were wells here in these underground caverns, so they didn't need to leave them. Here we go. And ow, bang my head. But now, so Sarah keeps saying man to man head. We're now into another room. This room again is a fairly big room. It's called the Salle de Fêtes, the room of the fêtes parties. But that's not quite a good term. This room has almost like a table in the front of it. I suppose that's why it's called the room of the Salle de Fêtes, because there's a table made out of hewn out of chalk. And here we have an interesting little section of wall covered in graffiti again, covered in the names of the soldiers. I don't like calling it graffiti because graffiti kind of gives you the impression of it's nonsense. None of this is nonsense. It's all very carefully written by the men, so you can clearly see what they're writing. So I'm just going to sit down on this table. So perhaps it's not a table, perhaps it's a seat. And we have quite extraordinary. This I find in this one room there are two sets of brothers. So there are two sets of brothers who both wrote their names here. So I'll say who they are first of all. James and George Tucker. They signed their names together, and Percy and Abel Ellis. They also sign their names in this room. So who are they? So James and George Tucker, their names are on the wall. James Edward Tucker, both serving in the 4th Field Artillery Brigade, both joining up at the same time, sequential numbers. So we know that they stood side by side when they enlisted. They will both survive the war, and in fact, James took a wife while he was in England, and he will take her back to Australia. She was called Isabella Ross, and they married in 1918 and went back to Australia, and they will live in Australia. George, actually, he must have been jealous of his brother, we can only guess, and he thought, I think I'll go and find myself an English bride. So after the war, he made his way back to the UK, but sadly, things won't go particularly well because, unfortunately, in 1933, he will be knocked down by a London bus in a snowstorm and killed. It's just terrible, isn't it? Survived the First World War and then killed by a bus in 1933 in London. But both of them survived the war, and both of them are remembered here. Their names are here. So the next brothers, Percy and Abel Ellis, they served together during the war in the 14th Battalion, but they didn't join together. Percy had joined in 1914. He joined very early and, been allocated to the 14th Battalion, fought at Gallipoli, wounded at Gallipoli, wounded when the battalion first came to the Western Front in the October of 1916, and then finally wounded and taken prisoner on the 11th of April 1917 during the first Battle of Bulcourt, and eventually will be repatriated to England. His brother obviously joined later on in 1915 and wanted to be with him because he was originally allocated to the 7th Battalion, but he transferred to the 14th Battalion and served with the 14th Battalion. Very sadly was killed in action at Poitiers on the 8th of August 1916, and again, no known grave commemorated on the National Memorial at Villas Bretonneux. There was a third brother, Thomas Ellis, and he returned to Australia. He survived as well, but he didn't sign his name with his two brothers, so he obviously wasn't serving with them. So we're going to stand up, get up off my seat, and we're going to head along, just round the corner to another little section called the Salle de Congrès. And this is just walking round the corner, and this is an interesting room because we have a large obelisk in the middle of this room with a football on the top of it. Lots of people's name engraved on the obelisk, and it's the people that were involved in the archaeology, the original archaeology, as they dug out the site here. But again, we have several areas of walls where we have nice smooth stonework, and it's those nice smooth sections in this area that have been heavily engraved, or not engraved, written on, because it's not engraving, this is pencil work, written on by soldiers here. And there's one, I'm just standing in front of him here now, and what we've got in here is, it says, Sergeant S. McCosha, VC, 1st 6th West Yorks. So this is a British soldier. The VC stands for Victoria Cross. So this is a man who'd already been awarded the Victoria Cross when he came into this room and actually signed the walls here. So who is he? Well, eventually he'll be Captain Samuel McCosher. But previously he'd been because obviously privates and rankers have numbers, number 1147 of the 1st of the 6th Battalion West Yorkshire Regiment. So that's a territorial regiment. It's part-time soldiers. He actually was a pre-war soldier, enlisted in the 6th Battalion on the 20th of February 1911. So he'd been serving since 1911, so he would have some idea of what it was going to be like to be a soldier, certainly. He'd been born in Leeds, Yorkshire, so he would have had an accent, well, not dissimilar to mine. The West Yorkshire accent and the East Yorkshire accent are quite different, but for the uninitiated, let's say it's kind of similar to mine. His father had been, or was, Polish-Russian, and his mother Irish, so that's where he gets his name from, Mikosha. He'd been awarded the Victoria Cross in the November of 1915 during fierce fighting on the Weser sector in Belgium, and he'd led a small platoon of men out into a network of isolated trenches during heavy shell fire, and basically what he'd done, he'd rescued men who were buried alive in the mud. Just extraordinary bravery under very heavy shell fire. He saved 4 people. And awarded the highest distinction that a soldier can be awarded in the British and Commonwealth forces, the Victoria Cross. He was only 22 years of age, and that Victoria Cross was awarded to him by the King on the 4th of March 1916. So probably just before he came here to sign his name on the walls here, because we haven't got a date as to when he signed his name. He was promoted to a lieutenant and then captain in 1919, and in fact went on again to serve in the Second World War as well. So we're going to head out again. It's across the room to the other side, round the spire with the football on the top. And we have another name. Now, this one's difficult to find, and certainly I lose this occasionally, this name. And it says Capt. I.S. Margetts, 12th Battalion. So this is another Australian soldier. Captain Ivor Stephen Margetts, MID, mentioned in dispatches, 12th Battalion. He was born on the 4th of September in 1891. Sarah's just pointing out exactly where his inscription is, so I'll remember next time I'm here. And sadly, he will be killed in action on the 24th of July at Poitiers, 1916. So this is, I think, this is one of the first officers' signatures that we've seen. As I said at the beginning of this explanation of these engravings and these names written on these walls, it's not just the men; it's also the officers that wrote their names. He's quite famous for an awful lot of reasons. I think one of the most important ones is here we've got his signature here, but for a long time you could have seen the marker marking his grave. Now he's got no known grave. He's actually commemorated on the Australian memorial at Villas Bretonneau, the memorial to the missing, the national memorial. He was buried on the battlefield, and in 1917, when we had an awful lot of photographers taking pictures of the battles of 1916, because the Germans have left those fields and have now moved back to the Hindenburg line, so we can now wander across the old battlefields of 1916. And there are several photographs in the Australian War Memorial collection that portray his original grave marker. The original grave marker was just a low cross, and then he had a little more substantial marker made and put on his grave later on. Sadly, when they tried to recover his body at the end of the war, he was no longer where he'd been put, or the marker was no longer where it had been put, or the marker was not there at all. We don't know which, but certainly his body was never found, and so he's on the memorial to the missing. He was one of those officers that the men loved him. He's written about quite a bit. His diaries are in the War Memorial in Australia, and we have an account just from a stretcher bearer who actually moved his body, carried his body to be buried. And his account: a shrapnel came into his left chest and apparently penetrated his heart. I helped him buried Monday morning in a shell, and he means a shell hole, near the place where he fell. He was the best man there was. Men loved him. I cried like a kid when I discovered he was dead. I think he went away because he was too good for the beast of war. I struck a small cross on his grave in his memory. So I think that's just very moving. So, yes, a man that died before his time. He's certainly well loved by his men, and I think would have had a great future if he'd survived. So let's just do one more in this room. And this man wrote almost his full title here. 1075 Private L. Barand, 10th of the 12th, 1916, 6th Machine Gun Company, AIF, Colac, 6th Brigade. Now, I had to ask Sarah, was Colac a place? I wasn't quite sure what that meant, and she said, yes, it is a place. Where is it, Sarah? Colac? No, it's in Victoria. So Colac in Victoria. So who is this? Well, it nearly tells you. He's number 1075, Sergeant Leslie Barand, MM. So another man awarded the military medal. 2nd Machine Gun Battalion. And he was awarded the MM on the 9th of August, that final push start of the 100 days. It started on the 8th of August, so second day. We took very heavy casualties on that day, but 9th of August 1918, awarded the MM at Framville, sorry. And he was born in Geelong in Victoria. He became quite a famous chap in a way because he eventually moved to Wagga, set up a very successful transport company. He became a local magistrate and eventually the mayor of Wagga, and I believe a street still carries his name. Very famous. He also got a little title. He was known as the Wagga Sniper because he'd fought on the Gallipoli Peninsula and he'd been a sniper there. He was a good shot, and when he moved to Wagga, after the war, he took part in several shooting competitions and was very successful, and so he got this nickname, the Wagga Sniper. So that's what he was known as. I think that's great, isn't it? There's these little stories in these caves. The little names written on the walls. They mean so much when you start looking into them. They have histories, and what happened to them next. Sadly, some of them didn't make it, but others went on to do interesting things. Have interesting lives. So you can hear me now. We're walking again, and we're heading along a little path, and Sarah stops again, and I know she's probably pointing out the fact that those two friends, William Police and Cecil Hyde, have signed their names again on another section of wall. This is quite wide. This is a wide shaft now, a wide tunnel that we're in now. And again, on the right-hand side, it's block built, and so we have lots and lots of signatures. I have to say, we're looking at signatures from 1914-18, but there are signatures before that, and there are an awful lot of signatures after the Great War, when people came back in the 20s, 30s, even up to the modern times. You'll get signatures on the 1980s. They try to stop people doing it now, but people who come here on very general tours, occasionally you'll find another little scratched signature on the walls here. So we're now going right and down a very narrow bit. Any minute now, Sarah's going to say, mind my head, because this bit is tight now, so it's almost touching my elbows, and I'm having to crouch as we go through. We go into a little gravelled area, and the clue here is when you're with your clients, when the gravel stops, you can stand up again. So that means that we can stand at full height. I can touch the ceiling. The roof is not far above us. This is rough hewn again. We've got no blocks here at all, so this is raw chalk and flint nodules. The floor's a bit unsteady. We've got a little bit of rippling in the floor, so you just have to watch your footing. Climbing up again through another cut doorway and into an area where we have, again, lots of little rooms off this central passage, and we've got some blockwork again. So we're just walking around the corner here, and perhaps two of the most interesting signatures we're coming to here, or interesting things that we can find on the walls here. So the first thing, I've called this the Digger Sketch Passage, and that gives us a clue. There are only two illustrations on the walls here, and this is one of them, and it's very obviously an Australian soldier with a slouch hat, hence the Digger Sketch Passage. No writing underneath it, nothing else, just a little brief sketch of an Australian soldier, and it's the only one that you can really identify as a soldier of all the sketches. And I say there are only two that we found. So I think it's fascinating that a little Australian, he bent into this doorway. On the side of the doorway, he just did a quick sketch of an Australian with his slouch hat, and we can recognise it. You can recognise straight away. Just glance at it, and you know exactly what he's drawing. So I move to a very narrow bit of the tunnel, and this very much feels like a tunnel because the roof is actually shaped here. We have a carved roof, so you're in a tunnel, and there are several names on the walls here, and this is probably the most important name from an Australian perspective. Well, generally speaking, I suppose from any perspective, this is a very well-known man that signed his name here. So here we find written on the walls, L.R. Blake, Lieutenant, 105th Howitzer Battery, 5th AFA, 7117. So who is this? Captain Leslie Russell Blake, MC, Military Cross, MID, mentioned in dispatches, Australian Field Artillery, 5th Brigade, 105th Howitzer Battery. So that's what he's serving in. And let's get it out of the way straight away, that he will die on the 3rd of October 1918. He dies of wounds received right in those final phases of the war. His name's tucked away in this narrow passage. Born on the 28th of October, 1890 in Hawthorne, Melbourne, Victoria. Studied at Sydney University and afterwards went on to, he was a geologist and a cartographer and joined the Queensland Mining Department. In 1911, he was offered a position to join the Douglas Mawson's scientific team to undertake a 3-year expedition to the Macquarie Islands, and they're about 850 miles southeast of Hobart. And he was responsible for mapping the island, so using his cartography. One of his companions was Frank Haley. Now, some of you may recognise that name. Frank Haley, he was the Australian official photographer during the Great War. And so he was with him, no doubt taking photographs. So you've got a photographer and a cartographer. Blake returned home and enlisted immediately. The war had started when they come back, and almost immediately enlisted. He had a bit of a problem in enlisting, and once he'd sorted out his problem, he enlisted as a private in the artillery, but when he was recognised for his education, he very rapidly rises through the ranks and was commissioned, became an officer. Awarded the Military Cross during the Battle of Poitiers. Just going to read what that says. Showed conspicuous and continual gallantry during the Poitiers operations, and he was surveying the front line. So surveying the front line held by our troops from northeast of Poitiers to Moocow Farm. So he was doing really what he did in civilian life, but doing it for the artillery. Supplied excellent reports and continually volunteered for his work, which he often performed under heavy fire. He was wounded in action on a number of occasions, and a shrapnel wound to his arm caused him quite a bit of problems, and he had to go back and recuperate in the UK for some time. And then, as we said, on the 2nd of October 1918, with the offensive nearly over, he found himself in the village of Hagricourt, should I say, on the Hindenburg line, and he was on horseback, and he was actually hit by a shell which blew off his leg, killed his horse from under him. He still survived that. He was taken to the 58th Casualty Clearing Station, where the rest of his leg was amputated, but unfortunately he had facial and head wounds as well, and he died of his wounds. So a very famous chap, and as I say, he signed his name here in 1917. Again, very difficult to find. And it's just I think it's great that we are doing this, that we go through and research and look at these names. And there's a chap called Gilles, I'll be talking about him later on, the archaeologist who did all of this work. That must have been a fantastic when he found, that he's actually got the name of somebody who was famous. So we're going to continue along the passage, another little room on our left-hand side, and again it's one that's only accessible if you're on one of these private tours. And we found two friends again who have signed their names together. W. Basing, this is what they've written. W. Basing and R.H. Durrow, 15th Battalion AIF, New South Wales, Australia. And we know, they didn't put a date on it, but we know that the 15th Battalion was here between the 16th and the 25th of July 1916, when both of these friends, who were both born in New South Wales, both had served at Gallipoli, and both will be wounded again together at Poitiers. So they signed this just before they moved into the front line at Poitiers when they were wounded on the 9th of August. So who were they exactly? So Corporal Walter Henry Basing, 15th Battalion AIF, wounded the 9th of August at Poitiers, and he died, unfortunately, of wounds on the 6th of July 1918, shrapnel head and right forearm at the Battle of La Hamel, or close to La Hamel, and is buried in Croy British Cemetery. His friend, Private Raymond Harold Durer, 15th Battalion AIF, wounded the 9th of August at Poitiers and captured on the 11th of April at Bulcourt, along with the 1,170 other Australians who were captured in the fighting at Bulcourt. So again, it's a terrible little story, but at least one of them gets through because he was captured. So off we go again, and we're going to head down the slope again. We've got rails at each side to stop us falling over, and we're entering very quickly. Just entering another room, and this one is called the Salle des Ancestors, and it's got a rather beautiful pillar in the middle of it with a cross on the top, a very ornate, almost Celtic cross on the top, and around it we have some wording. And basically what this is doing, this is where we commemorate all of those that lived during those periods of hardship, those periods of war, who came to these caves and lived. So it's commemorating those who sought refuge here at times of warfare here. So it's a lovely room, but it's no flat surfaces, so there are no signatures, or very few signatures in this room. You can never say no, because when you look carefully, you will often find one or two. So down some steps. Okay, so here we are. We're now approaching the next room, and this is called Salle Alsop. So Salbian Room, so Room Alsop. Again, this is a room that's not open to the public, so Sarah's just ahead of me. She's just going to unlock the door. Now, this is the final room on the tour. It's a big room, lots of space. The ceiling has gone up again to, I don't know, more meters above us. So we're just opening the door. She's just going to turn the light on. Okay, so walking into it. Again, immediately in front of us, we've got an enormous wall made out of blockwork, and that's what we really look for, is this blockwork, because the blockwork is what encourages the men of 1914-18 to come and sign their names. So we're in an area here, and this is also kind of, because it is used just by people on battlefield tours who are coming here into these caves. This is used as a little memorial. We have a poppy wreath here and some poppies and things here, because we have a whole wall of soldiers' names and a real mix of names. So Sarah's just pointing one out, and that one is why the room is called Salle Alsop. It's Wilfred Allen Alsop, and his signature can be found on these walls. And he's no different to any of the other soldiers here, but there's an interesting little story that goes with him. So what did he write? Well, he wrote 2nd of the Fair 17, so 2nd of January 1917, and that terrible winter of 1617, coldest winter for 40 years. It was probably not quite nice down here, out of the snow and the horrible cold weather. It'd be quite warm in here with lots of people in here together. So A. Alsop Mossman, Sydney. So who is he? He's number 6,777, Private Wilfred Joseph Allen Alsop, 8th Australian Field Ambulance, and he also served in the Signal Company at the end of the war. He was known as Allen because his father had the same name as him, Wilfred, so everybody called him Allen. He enlisted in the July of 1915, and this is the fascinating thing. This is what lots of people have looked for. It's some kind of proof as to why people were coming here and what was going on. And Allen actually kept a diary, and the entry on the 2nd of January 1917 reads, "In the afternoon, a party of 10 of us went for a trip to the famous caves near Naours, where the refugees used to hide in time of invasion. These caves contain about 300 rooms, one cave being a half a mile long. A whole division of troops with horses, artillery, and all the transport could be put into these caves." I think he was exaggerating just a little bit. "The names of John Norton and Eva Panett are to be seen autographed on the stone erected just inside the entrance." Now, I have to say, is we had no idea, Sarah and I had no idea who John Norton and Eva Purnett were, and we just actually looked them up to see who they were, and they're an Australian journalist and politician. And I think he's even known a newspaper proprietor, I think it was described as, so he probably owned a newspaper. And he was here over with his niece. I think Eva Purnett is his niece, and they wrote their autographs here. So they must have come across here during the war and written their names here. So obviously being Australians, it was pointed out to them. There's another little story that goes very nicely with this. So he was here, he kept a diary. So that's the first thing. He's the first guy that we found that kept a diary that mentions coming to these caves. But almost as importantly, there is another site very close to here in the next village. It's a village called Vignacourt. It's not quite the next village, but close by. And Vignacourt is where a photographer set up. And some of you may remember the story of the finding of the glass plates of that photographer, which it's a long-winded story, which I won't bore you with, but they end up in the War Memorial. They are now owned by the War Memorial. But a museum is set up where the photographer called Thuillier set up his studio in Vignacourt. There's now a museum, and you can go to that museum. I would highly recommend that if you're coming this way and you do this tour of these caves, that you also go to look at the photographs at Vignacourt. And he had his photograph taken, and they've got a copy of that photograph, and it's on display. So for the first time, we can actually see a man who signed his name here. He survived the war, but he also had his photograph taken as well, and we can look at his photograph. And I think that's just a great connection to the two sites. We've actually done it again. There's now a second link, a chap called Herbert J Hunt. He is also signed his signature here, and he is also recorded in a photograph at Vignacourt. So it's nice to kind of join the two stories together. Alan returned to Australia in April 1919 and died in November 1956, but he's still remembered here, both in photograph and in signature on the walls. So just the final name that we're going to look at here. We're going to turn around, and there's another block. Sarah's going to point out to me so I remember where he is. Yep, okay, got him. Yeah, up there. So he is E.W. Corrie. He's got 17th BAT, 17th Battalion AIF, Australian Imperial Forces, Singleton, New South Wales. And he was Lance Sergeant Ernest Walter Corrie of the 17th Battalion. And he was from Scott's Flat in Singleton, New South Wales. Wounded at Poitiers, a gunshot wound to the face. And again wounded on the 9th of the 10th, 17 at Passchendaele. He's on the Broodsin Ridge during the Battle of Passchendaele, or the Broodsin Ridge, and he was wounded with a shot in the arm, but he was killed on his way to the dressing station, aged 22, so killed by a shell, and he never made it to the dressing station. He sadly is missing, and he's commemorated on the Menin Gate at Ypres, so he's on this memorial. We're now leaving the caves, oh yeah, Sarah's just pointing out one more thing. Just as literally as we're leaving, W Police, Perth. He's got his name almost on one of the last blocks in the site as we head out of it. So we're walking back to that gateway. Sarah's going to close the gate, and what we're actually going to come to now, and so I have to say, it's not to everybody's taste, but it's part of the story here. And this is the story of the people that hid and worked here. And we've got some mannequins, and those mannequins depict, we're going to walk through an area where the mannequins are, and those mannequins depict the various trades of the people that lived and worked in these caverns in times of war. What we're also going to come to then is a brand new visitor centre. Now, I have to say, the visitor centre is sad in many ways. It's because it wasn't completed until the February of 2020, and it was just getting geared up for all the clients to come. And of course, then we hit the pandemic. So, in fact, very few, if any, people have been to see the visitor centre yet, and it's well worth looking at. It's very interesting. It's filled with information about the men who wrote the names, the chaps that we've just been talking about. It tells you a little bit about the life behind the lines, and it also gives you an indication that this is not the only site where people scratch their names into the walls. There are other sites, but this is perhaps the most famous and certainly the most accessible. The other sites where we know that they graffitied the walls or scratched their names into the walls, we can no longer get to. So we're almost at the end here, so I'm just going to do a big thank you to Sarah, who's standing beside me here, our Australian guide, who helped us find our way around the site. Also to the Cité Souterrain de Naours for permission to film at a time when it's very difficult to get anywhere because of this terrible COVID. And then what we also need to remember and thank is Gilles Prilot. I'm almost certainly saying his second name not quite right, for all his work that he did, the research that he did on the Australian soldiers, which has an interesting story because he didn't come here initially to do that. He was researching the 30-Year War, and as he was researching the 30-Year War as an archaeologist, he kept glancing up and seeing all these names of the Australian soldiers, and he went off on a completely different tangent and started doing the research of these Australians, which had really been forgotten. They'd been forgotten about their names were here. I mean, everybody walks past them, but nobody had really bothered to research them. So fantastic research he's done, and it's ongoing. We're still doing research, or he is still doing research. And in fact, Sarah and I have helped in the past. We've pointed him in the right direction a few times, and hopefully what we're hoping that will happen in the future is that some of the British soldiers on here, much more difficult to research, will be commemorated as well, more so than they are. Hence that's why it's been a bit of an Australian leading to this walk on the ground. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you'll join me again on the next time that we actually get on the ground out and about.